Hello, and thank you for taking part in the Justice Center's webinar concerning pre-employment checks. My name is Deirdre Keating, and I'm the Director of the Criminal Background Check Unit at the Justice Center. I'd like to start by apologizing for the technical difficulties encountered with last week's webinar. We know your time is very valuable and deeply regret the inconvenience. Today I'll start with a brief overview of the criminal background checks, the staff exclusion list checks, and inquiries to the statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment. Then I will go into more detail about each check and have time for questions at the end. You may enter questions in your computer in the question panel on the right side of the screen, and you may always send questions to the Criminal Background Check Unit's email at cbc@justicecenter.ny.gov. I may not know the answer to each of your questions today, but I will make every effort to get back to you with an answer. I have found that the providers I have spoken with during this past month have had great questions, and we appreciate your input. My comments on the slides will take about 20 minutes. And then we will have a 15-minute break so that we may gather your questions and come back after the break to respond to as many of them as we can get to. Thank you. To start, a little bit about the Justice Center. The Justice Center for the Protection of People with Special Needs was created to strengthen and standardize the safety net for persons who receive care from New York State and private providers licensed, certified, funded, or approved by a state oversight agency. It becomes operational on June 30th, 2013. State oversight agencies are the state agencies that operate, license, or certify an applicable facility or provider agency and includes the Office of Mental Health, OMH, the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, OPWDD, the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services, OASS, the Office of Children and Family Services, OCFS, the Department of Health, DOH, and the State Education Department, SED. The pre-employment checks discussed today apply to prospective staff hired on or after June 30th of 2013. Hired can cover volunteers, consultants, interns, and contractors, while they might not be technically hired. The Protection of People with Special Needs Act centralizes within the Justice Center the criminal background check process for facilities or provider agencies overseen by OMH, OPWDD, and any residential programs or facilities licensed or certified by OCFS. The Act also gives OASIS the authority to conduct criminal background checks on prospective employees or volunteers with regular and substantial unsupervised or unrestricted physical contacts with clients for every provider of services who contracts with, is approved by, or otherwise authorized by OASIS to provide services. I will go into more on the criminal history background checks, but first to continue the brief overview of the other checks. The Vulnerable Persons Central Register, which was created by the Justice Center legislation, includes a staff exclusion list. The SEL contains individuals found ineligible to work in a position involving regular and substantial contact with a service recipient. Prior to requesting a CBC, certain entities must request a check of the SEL when seriously considering an applicant for employment. The Vulnerable Persons Central Register receives reports of allegations of reportable incidents involving persons receiving services in facilities or provider agencies subject to the requirements of this article. I'll just tell you a little bit about how someone gets on the staff exclusion list, but then we'll continue with the brief overview of the other checks. Reports of allegations of reportable incidents are investigated, and if it results in a finding of a Category 1 level of abuse or neglect, a person may be placed on the SEL if that person does not request an amendment to the substantiated finding within a specified time, or does request an amendment and the request is denied. When an individual requests an amendment of a substantiated report of abuse or neglect, it is reviewed by the Justice Center's Administrative Appeals Unit. If this unit finds, by a preponderance of evidence, that supports the substantiated finding, the individual has a right to a hearing before an administrative law judge. If the administrative law judge finds that a preponderance of evidence supports the charge of abuse or neglect, a final order is issued and the individual is placed on the SEL. If at any point in the process the substantiated finding is not upheld, the individual is not placed on the SEL. And finally, a little bit about the statewide central register. The list of providers that must check the statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment, also known as the SCR, was expanded to include facility or provider agency, as defined in Social Services Law, Section 488, Subdivision 4. If you are newly required after June 30th to check the SCR as part of the pre-employment screening, a provider must apply through OCFS for such access. All entities that are required to do an SEL check must also do an SCR check if the subject of inquiry is not on the SEL, even if the program does not deal with children. However, if the subject is on the staff exclusion list, there is no need to proceed with the criminal background check or the state central register check. Now, after that brief overview, I will go into a little more detail about each of these checks. First, the criminal background checks. The Justice Center Criminal Background Check Unit staff will have some familiar names from OMH and OPWDD providers. The criminal background check staff of each of those agencies will become part of the Justice Center's Criminal Background Check Unit. OMH providers that are used to the CHITS will be happy to know that the Justice Center has copied that system to be part of its criminal background check system. The results and the interactions for OMH providers will be virtually the same. They will submit prints the same way, and the authorized person will receive an email to check the Justice Center CBC, and the determinations you used to see in CHITS you will now see in the Justice Center CBC. OPWDD providers and registered providers will still submit prints the same way, but now, instead of getting a response from OPWDD, you will receive a response from the Justice Center. OCFS licensed or certified residential programs or facilities will submit fingerprints using MorphoTrust, the company that was awarded the state contract for civil fingerprint submissions, and will receive a response from the Justice Center. A few words here are necessary about OCFS providers subject to the Justice Center checks. The current Social Services Law 378A, which is effective until June 30th, permits but does not require authorized agencies to request from DCJS a New York State conviction-only record on prospective staff directly involved with the care and supervision of children. This law was amended in the Justice Center legislation so that state criminal history must be requested on a prospective operator, employee, or volunteer who will have regular and substantial unsupervised or unrestricted contact with children in the program by any residential programs or facilities licensed or certified by OCFS, except for foster family homes and residential programs for victims of domestic violence. There is legislation currently pending which will also provide for federal criminal history responses for these providers. So any authorized agency that voluntarily entered into an agreement with DCJS for such access to criminal history in the past that operates a residential program or facility licensed or certified by OCFS will no longer deal directly with DCJS, but instead request such criminal background check of the Justice Center and receive responses regarding suitability for employment or volunteer service from the Justice Center in accordance with the same standards that apply with OMH and OPWDD's criminal background checks. There will be some changes for users with the new criminal background check system with the Justice Center. These will include every user having new NYSDS passwords, which will be provided to you soon. And while only OMH providers may access the system now, Phase 2 development involves permitting all providers being able to access the system. Also, all fingerprint submissions will eventually be coming in through MorphoTrust as existing OMH and OPWDD live scan equipment ages out. You may have received notice of the blackout period. From 3 p.m. on Friday, June 21st through 9 a.m. on Monday, July 1st, OMH and OPWDD providers will not be able to submit fingerprints and requests for criminal background checks. The blackout period is critically important as it will enable prints submitted before 3 p.m. on Friday, June 21st to cycle through the system and permit the input of all necessary data to ensure that Justice Center CBC system works effectively. OMH and OPWDD will notify providers of subsequent arrest during this blackout period. There is one change from the prior notice sent regarding this blackout period. There will be a time frame within this blackout period when OMH providers will not be able to access chits. If a provider operates a program for more than one state oversight agency involved in the Justice Center CBC system, that is, OMH, OPWDD, and residential facilities or programs licensed or certified by OCFS, only one CBC is required for an applicant who meets the fingerprinting criteria if the provider checks for all programs simultaneously and indicates that on the submission. It must be simultaneous for all programs because the FBI doesn't have the subsequent arrest notification capability that DCJS does. The Justice Center and OASIS have agreed to copy the waiver program that OMH and OPWDD utilized. If an applicant meets the fingerprinting criteria for the Justice Center CBC and OASIS CBC, the provider may, at the time of registering for the fingerprint submission, request such a waiver. The Justice Center and OASIS will separately proceed with reviews of the applicant's criminal history and will independently advise the provider's authorized person of their determinations. Please be clear, we are not waiving the fingerprinting requirement, just making an applicant not have to get printed twice. In all cases where a waiver will be requested, the provider's authorized person needs to follow the initial steps of either the Justice Center's or OASIS's criminal history record check process and enter the applicant's identifying information in the appropriate database for capturing applicant information. The criminal background check forms that you were used to will still be here, but they will now be Justice Center forms. We have the authorized person designation and sworn statement forms. There are two separate flavors of this form, one to designate a person to be able to conduct the criminal background check and the SEL check, or for those providers that are not authorized to get a criminal history background check with the Justice Center, they would just fill out the authorized person designation and sworn statement form for staff exclusion list checks. There is also the SEL check request form, the applicant consent for fingerprinting form, the request for CBC form, fingerprint submission authorization form, change in status form, and personal criminal history information review form. These will all be available on the Justice Center's website. Moving on to the SEL, I will go through each of these questions in the following slides. Who must request a check of the SEL? Facilities and provider agencies as defined in Social Services Law, Section 488, Subdivision 4. Providers of services to persons in programs licensed, certified, or funded by any state oversight agency, and other providers or licensing agencies required to conduct an inquiry of the SCR. What individuals must be checked? any person who will have regular and substantial contact with the service recipient. Any person can include an employee, administrator, consultant, intern, volunteer, or contractor. Prior to submitting fingerprints for a CBC check, a provider's authorized person shall submit the SEL check request form via fax to the Justice Center CBC unit. The SEL check request form will have a part for applicant data and a part for the authorized person's contact information. As I described the process of getting on the SEL, it is apparent that it will be some time before anyone is on the SEL. Taking into account that reality, the Justice Center has decided that during the first 2 weeks of operation, July 1st through July 14th, a provider does not have to await the Justice Center's response to their SEL check request prior to proceeding with the criminal background check. How is the response delivered? The Justice Center CBC unit will send the authorized person who submitted the request an email with the results of each search. This is what the email response will look like. While a provider may have more than one authorized person, only the authorized person on the SEL request form will get responded to. This is different from the Justice Center CBC, wherein that all authorized persons get an email indicating either for OMH providers to check the Justice Center CBC, or for OPWDD and OCFS providers, an email with the determination from the Justice Center. If the applicant is on the SEL, a facility, provider agency, and all other providers of services in programs operated, licensed, or certified by any SOA shall not hire or otherwise allow such a person to have regular and substantial contact with the service recipient. If the applicant is on the SEL, other providers or licensing agencies as defined in Social Services Law, Sections 424A, Subdivisions 3 or 4, shall determine whether to hire or allow such person to have regular and substantial contact with the service recipients in accordance with guidelines developed by OCFS. If an applicant is on the SEL, there is no criminal background check or state central register inquiry required. The inquiry ends. If the applicant is not on the SEL, a CBC, if required, and an inquiry of the SCR, if required, must be conducted if the applicant is not on the SEL. And finally, a little bit about the SCR inquiry. As indicated previously, Social Services Law, Section 424A, Subdivisions 3 and 4, lists providers, provider agencies, or licensing agencies which are required to conduct an inquiry of the SCR through OCFS. The Justice Center is not involved with the SCR inquiry. Having an indicated report on the SCR is not a bar to hiring. OCFS is working with the other state oversight agencies to get all required providers, provider agencies, or licensing agencies into the online clearance system so that they may conduct inquiries of the SCR. OCFS is also working with the other SOAs on guidance for employers when an applicant has an indicated report on the Child Abuse and Neglect Central Register. We'll take a short break to give you time to enter questions on the right side of the panel, and we'll start again in 15 minutes to answer your questions.